I had been working the late shift at the small diner for nearly a year, a place called Joe's All Night Eats. The hours were long, and the customers were usually the same. Overworked truck drivers, college students cramming for exams, and the occasional insomniac searching for solace in a cup of coffee and greasy food. It was a routine I had grown accustomed to, but nothing could prepare me for what happened that night. The clock ticked toward midnight as I wiped down the counter, the fluorescent lights flickering above me. The diner was empty, save for one lone customer in the far booth. He was a man in his 50s, scruffy and disheveled, with a weathered face that told stories of a hard life. He sat hunched over a plate of cold pancakes, staring blankly at the food as if it held some hidden meaning. I approached him with a friendly smile. "Can I get you anything else?" He looked up slowly, his eyes hollow and distant. "No, just thinking," he murmured, his voice gruff. I nodded, sensing he didn't want to talk, and returned to the counter, my curiosity piqued. The diner had seen its share of strange characters, but there was something unsettling about this man. The way he sat there alone in the dim light made my skin crawl. As I continued my cleaning, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced over at the man, and our eyes met for a brief moment. His gaze was penetrating, as if he could see right through me. I quickly looked away, a shiver running down my spine. Minutes ticked by, and the silence in the diner grew heavier. I busied myself with small tasks, refilling condiments, wiping down tables, but my mind kept drifting back to the man. Something about him felt off, a dark energy that seemed to seep into the very walls of the diner. Suddenly, the bell above the door chimed, breaking the stillness. I turned to see a figure entering, a woman in her late 20s with disheveled hair and dark circles under her eyes. She looked around the diner, her expression one of desperation. "Do you have any available seats?" she asked, glancing at the empty booths. I nodded, gesturing toward a table near the window. "You can sit there." As she moved to take a seat, I noticed her glance nervously at the man in the booth. He hadn't moved, still staring at his plate with that same vacant expression. I felt a pang of sympathy for her. She looked like she had been through hell. "Can I get you something to drink?" I asked the woman as she settled into her seat. "A coffee, please," she replied, her voice shaky. I poured her a cup and placed it on the table. "You okay?" She hesitated, glancing toward the man. "I'm just waiting for someone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Late night?" I offered, trying to lighten the mood. "Yeah," she said, but her eyes darted back to the man, and I could see the fear written across her face. I turned to check on him again. He hadn't touched his food, and I felt an urge to approach him once more. "Hey, everything okay?" I asked, stepping closer. He looked up, and his eyes were unsettlingly vacant. "I'm waiting for my meal," he said slowly, as if the words were a great effort to form. I glanced at the clock. "You've been here for a while. Did you order anything?" His expression shifted, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of anger. "You don't know anything," he growled, suddenly animated. "You think this is just a diner? This is a place of waiting. Waiting for what?" I asked, my voice wavering slightly. But before he could answer, the woman at the other table let out a small gasp. I turned to see her staring wide-eyed at the man. "You're him, aren't you?" she whispered, her face paling. "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. "The news. They said he would be here," she said, her voice trembling. My heart raced as I pieced together her words. I remembered seeing something on social media earlier that day about a local man who had gone missing. A man who had been last seen near this very diner. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Are you the one they're looking for?" He smiled then, but it was a chilling, sinister grin. "You have no idea what's really happening here," he said, leaning back in his booth. The atmosphere in the diner shifted dramatically. The tension grew thick as the woman's breath quickened. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice shaking. His grin widened. "I didn't do anything. They did." I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. "Who?" But before he could respond, the bell above the door chimed again. Another man entered the diner, a figure shrouded in a long coat and a hat that obscured his face. He moved with purpose, scanning the room before his gaze settled on the man in the booth. The woman's eyes widened in fear, and she instinctively shrank back in her seat. I felt my stomach drop as I watched the newcomer approach the booth. "Is he here?" the man asked, his voice low and grave. The scruffy man looked up, his demeanor shifting from eerie calmness to sudden urgency. I wasn't expecting you," he stammered, the confidence fading from his voice. "Too late for that," the newcomer replied, a hint of menace in his tone. "You know the deal." I was paralyzed with fear, unable to look away as the tension escalated. The woman stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need to go," she shouted, her voice laced with panic. But before she could make a move, the scruffy man shot out of his seat, blocking her path. "You can't leave. You're part of this now," he yelled, his voice rising to a fever pitch. I instinctively reached for my phone, my hands shaking as I fumbled to dial 911. "Stay back," I shouted, backing away toward the counter. The woman's face was pale with fear as she backed toward the door, but the newcomer advanced, his presence looming over her. "You can't run from what you don't understand," he said ominously. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a loud crash echoed from the kitchen. My heart raced as I glanced back, adrenaline surging through me. "What's happening?" I yelled, panic rising in my chest. The woman darted for the door, but the scruffy man lunged for her, grabbing her wrist. "No, you can't go," he shouted, desperation etched across his face. "Let her go," I screamed, my voice cracking. In that moment of chaos, the newcomer lunged forward, and the woman screamed, trying to pull free. "Help! Someone help!" she cried out, but the diner was eerily silent, as if the world outside had vanished. I watched in horror as the two men struggled, their clash reverberating through the small diner like a thunderstorm. The atmosphere was electric, filled with tension and fear. I knew I had to act. Grabbing a coffee pot from the counter, its glass cold and heavy in my hand, I shouted, "Get away from her!" The scruffy man turned toward me, his expression darkening. "You shouldn't have gotten involved," he spat, and in that moment, something inside him snapped. With a surge of adrenaline, I hurled the coffee pot at him, shattering it against his face. He stumbled back, his hands flying to his bleeding forehead as shards of glass scattered around him. "Run!" I shouted to the woman. She bolted toward the door, but before she could reach it, the newcomer blocked her path, his eyes narrowed in rage. "You're not getting away that easily," he growled, lunging forward. I felt a rush of fear as the diner erupted into chaos. The woman stumbled backward, but I rushed forward, shoving the newcomer with all my might. "Get away from her!" I screamed, my heart pounding in my chest. The scuffle continued, and I could see the woman glancing toward the exit. "Go! Call for help!" I yelled, desperate to get her to safety. She hesitated for a split second, then sprinted for the door, flinging it open and bolting into the night. With the woman free, I turned my focus back to the two men. The scruffy man was now rising to his feet, blood dripping down his face. "You don't know what you've done," he snarled, eyes wild with fury. "Get out!" I shouted, adrenaline fueling my voice. The newcomer lunged at me, but I sidestepped just in time, sending him crashing into a booth. The force knocked the wind out of him, and I seized the moment to bolt for the door. I sprinted outside into the cool night air, my heart racing. "Help! Someone help!" I shouted, glancing around frantically for anyone who could assist. I spotted the woman in the distance, dialing her phone as she spoke to someone. Relief flooded through me as I realized she was calling for help. Turning back toward the diner, I saw the two men emerge, a fierce look of determination on their faces. They weren't done yet. With my heart pounding, I grabbed a nearby trash can and hurled it toward them. "Stay back!" I shouted, fear and adrenaline surging through me. The trash can hit the scruffy man, and he stumbled back, momentarily disoriented. The other man seized the opportunity, lunging forward. The sound of sirens approached in the distance, but it felt like an eternity before help would arrive. "Get inside! Lock the door!" I yelled to the woman. The sound of footsteps closing in made me freeze in place. Just as the first police car rounded the corner, I felt a sharp pain in my side as the newcomer lunged at me, his hand gripping my shirt tightly. "You shouldn't have interfered," he hissed. But just as quickly, the sirens blared louder, and the police arrived, their lights flashing brightly. Officers jumped out of the car, guns drawn, shouting commands. "Get on the ground! Now!" The sight of the officers filled me with relief as they rushed toward us, ready to take control of the situation. The scruffy man hesitated for a moment before stepping back, and the newcomer turned to flee. But it was too late. The officers tackled him to the ground, cuffing him in an instant. I fell to my knees, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the adrenaline slowly ebbed away. The woman rushed to my side, her eyes wide with fear and gratitude. "Thank you. I thought we were going to die," she said, her voice trembling. As the police detained the two men, I felt a mixture of relief and horror wash over me. I had witnessed something so disturbing, so incomprehensible. Two strangers caught in a violent clash, yet somehow it felt personal. "Are you okay?" one of the officers asked, his expression serious. "I think so," I replied, my hands still shaking. "But who were they?" The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "We're not sure yet, but we'll find out. You did the right thing by calling for help." As the chaos settled around me, I realized I was forever changed. The diner, my safe haven, had turned into a nightmare. I could no longer view it the same way. I would always remember that night. The fear, the desperation, the violence. The last customer had changed everything, and I knew I would never feel safe again.